Hey everyone, this is Conflict Tales. You won't believe what happened this time. Let's dive into another wild and dramatic story. I was standing on my own damn driveway, hands cuffed behind my back, with flashing red and blue lights painting the front of my house. Ominous. The whole neighborhood had gathered, whispering and murmuring as two officers escorted me towards the squad car. The irony? This wasn't some big crime scene. No, this was the result of a months-long war between me and the Homeowner Association, spearheaded by none other than Karen herself. My crime? Parking my own damn truck in my own damn driveway. Karen stood there with a smug grin, arms crossed over her floral blouse, nodding approvingly as the officers did their job. This was the culmination of everything she had thrown at me. The fines, the complaints, the threats, the vandalism. I had fought back every time. But now I was the one getting hauled away in handcuffs, and she knew it. She relished it. How did it come to this? Let me take you back to the beginning. When I first moved into this neighborhood, I thought it was the perfect place. A quiet, suburban street, good folks minding their own business, and enough space to finally have a home base after years on the road. As a long-haul trucker, my rig was my livelihood. It wasn't just a vehicle, it was my second home, and since I finally bought my first house with a long driveway, I figured it'd be the perfect spot to park it between trips. Turns out, I was dead wrong. The first sign of trouble came just 3 days after I moved in. A note, typed and placed neatly under my front door. Dear homeowner, your vehicle is in violation of community aesthetic guidelines. Please remove it within 48 hours to avoid further action. Homeowner Association. I barely had time to unpack and they were already on my case. I crumpled up the letter, figuring I'd deal with it later, but that later came fast. The very next day I found Karen herself waiting outside my house, arms folded, eyes narrowed. You got my note, she said. It wasn't a question. I sighed. Yeah, I got it. She gestured toward my truck. That thing has to go. This is a community with standards. I gave her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she just didn't understand. It's not just a truck, I explained. I'm a long-haul driver. That's my livelihood. Karen scoffed. Then park it somewhere else. We can't have that thing ruining property values. Ruining property values? I let out a short laugh. Lady, I bought this house. I pay my dues like everyone else. That driveway is mine. Her lips thinned. You'll be fined. I shrugged. Go ahead, send me the bill. And that's exactly what she did. 2 days later, a bright yellow violation notice was taped to my garage. Unapproved vehicle storage, $250 fine. I ignored it, then another, and another. Each time, the fines increased. Karen wasn't letting up. Then came the late-night harassment. One morning, I woke up to find all my truck's tires slashed. No security footage, no witnesses. I knew it was them. But proving it? That was another story. A week later, I found an eviction notice on my door. Continued non-compliance with Homeowner Association rules. Immediate removal required. This wasn't just about fines anymore. They were trying to get rid of me. I got myself a lawyer, a sharp one named Lelsey Raitt. She took one look at the paperwork and shook her head. They can't legally evict you over this. They're bluffing. So I fought back. I filed counterclaims. I refused to pay the fines. I reported the vandalism to the police. But Homeowner Association had their own connections. One night, 2 officers showed up at my door. Officer Rivera, a man who had been working with Homeowner Association for years, handed me a citation. We got multiple noise complaints about your truck. I stared at him. It hasn't moved in a week. He shrugged. Still, complaints are complaints. I suggest you comply before this gets worse. It was a warning, and I didn't take it. I wasn't going to be bullied, but I underestimated how deep this corruption ran. A few nights later, someone broke into my garage. They didn't steal anything. They just trashed the place. My tools were scattered. The windshield of my truck was smashed, and spray painted across my garage door was one word: leave. That was it. That was the moment I knew I wasn't dealing with just a petty homeowner association dispute. This was war, and if they wanted a fight, I'd give them one. What I didn't know was just how far they were willing to go to make me disappear. I knew they wouldn't stop. Not after the fines, not after the threats, not even after the break-in. Karen and her homeowner association weren't just some petty suburban overlords. They were operating like a damn crime syndicate, and I was standing in their way. I needed a plan, and I needed it fast. The morning after the vandalism, I drove my truck straight to a mechanic to replace the windshield. That wasn't cheap, but I wasn't about to let them scare me off. As I sat in the shop waiting, my phone rang. It was Lelsey Raitt, my lawyer. She had some updates. "They're pushing harder than I expected," she said. "I pulled up property records. Something weird's going on. The Homeowner Association shouldn't have this much authority, but they do. Someone high up is helping them." I frowned. "Like who?" She sighed. "That's what I'm trying to find out. But listen, they're filing another complaint, this time with the city. They want to get an official ordinance passed banning large commercial vehicles from all residential areas." I clenched my jaw. "That's bullshit. They're targeting me." "Of course they are," she said. "And if they succeed, your truck is illegal the second that ordinance passes. They'll fine you every single day you don't move it." I felt a rage boil in my chest. "What can I do?" She hesitated. "We fight it. But you need to start gathering proof. Anything shady they've done. Fines, threats, property damage, that police officer Rivera showing up for complaints. Document everything." That night, I installed security cameras, 4 of them covering my house from every angle. If someone so much as stepped onto my driveway, I'd see it. I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to make sure they paid for every single thing they'd done. The next day, a fresh violation notice was taped to my garage. "Failure to comply. $500 fine." I ripped it off, tossed it into a pile with the rest. Then I went to work. I started knocking on doors, talking to my neighbors. Most of them weren't willing to stand up against Homeowner Association, but a few had stories of their own. "They made me repaint my house 3 times, an elderly woman named Mrs. Connolly said. Said the color wasn't community approved. Cost me thousands. They shut down my son's treehouse, a man named Greg told me. Said it was a safety violation. They're bullies." I took notes, collected statements. I wasn't the only one suffering here. Karen and her people had been controlling this place for years, unchecked. It was time to change that. Then came the police, again. Officer Rivera knocked on my door that evening looking tired, but still holding that air of smug authority. "Mr. Miller, another complaint." I crossed my arms. "Let me guess, noise violation?" "No," he said, disturbing the peace. I scoffed. "Because I talked to my neighbors." He didn't even blink. "They said you were harassing them." I stared at him, the anger simmering just below the surface. "You know this is bullshit, right?" He let out a breath, shifting slightly. "Look, I don't like being dragged into homeowner association disputes, but complaints are complaints. If I get called, I have to respond." I took a step closer. "Who's making these calls?" He hesitated. "Anonymous reports." "Right, sure. And you believe that?" He sighed. "Just stay out of trouble, Miller." That night, I reviewed my security footage. At 2 a.m., a shadowy figure crept onto my driveway. The footage was grainy, but I could see them slashing at my truck's tires. Again. I rewound the tape, trying to catch a better look. They moved fast, but as they turned toward the streetlight, I saw a familiar floral pattern, Karen's damn blouse. I called Lelsey first thing in the morning. "I got her on tape," I said, slashing my tires. There was a pause. Then, "Send it to me. Now." I did. A few minutes later, she called back. "This is good, but we need more. You take this to the police now, and they'll make it disappear. You need undeniable proof." I gritted my teeth. "How the hell do I get that?" She hesitated. "I might have an idea." 2 nights later, I set up. I parked my truck in the same spot, but this time, I installed a hidden camera inside the cab. I turned off the porch lights, made it look like I was gone. Then I waited. And sure enough, at around 1:30 a.m., someone crept up the driveway. But this time, it wasn't Karen. It was someone bigger. A man, dressed in dark clothing. He wasn't slashing tires. He was holding a damn crowbar. I watched from inside my house, heart pounding. Then he did something unexpected. He didn't touch the truck. He went for my garage door. I grabbed my phone, dialing 911. Someone's breaking into my house. The next minutes were chaos. The man had just pried the garage open when the red and blue lights flooded the street. He bolted, but the cops were fast. I ran outside as they tackled him to the ground. Officer Rivera stood over the guy, breathing hard. Then he looked at me. "Recognize him?" I walked closer, my blood turning cold. It wasn't just some thug. It was the Homeowner Association's so-called security contractor. And suddenly, everything clicked. This wasn't just Karen. This was bigger than her. The Homeowner Association was running something shady, and they wanted me gone because I was close to exposing it. I looked Rivera in the eye. "Now, do you believe me?" He didn't say anything, but I saw the shift. He wasn't on their side anymore. I stood in the middle of my driveway, staring at the police cruiser parked on the curb. The man they arrested last night, the so-called security contractor for the Homeowner Association, had been taken in for attempted burglary. But something about the whole situation didn't sit right with me. He wasn't some random thug. He had training, he moved with precision, and most importantly, he was working for someone higher up. Karen was just a pawn in a much bigger game. The question was, who was pulling the strings? The next morning, I met with Lelsey Raitt in her office downtown. She had been up all night digging through records, and the look on her face told me she had found something big. "You're not going to believe this," she said, pushing a stack of papers toward me. "The Homeowner Association is sitting on a multi-million-dollar land deal. Your property and a few others are the last pieces they need." I scanned the documents, my stomach twisting. "Who's behind this?" She hesitated. "Officially, a development firm called Silver Lake Ventures. Unofficially, the city's planning commissioner and a handful of local officials. They've been working through shell companies to buy up land for a high-end shopping center." I exhaled sharply. "And they're using the Homeowner Association to do their dirty work?" "Exactly. The fines, the threats, the break-ins. It's all about making you give up and sell." I clenched my fists. "That's not happening." Lelsey leaned back. "Then we need to go on the offensive. If we can expose this, we can blow the whole thing up before they can force you out." That night, I set up additional security cameras, making sure every angle of my property was covered. I wasn't going to let another attack happen without catching them in the act. Then I made a few calls. If the Homeowner Association and their backers wanted a war, I was ready to fight back. The first step was public pressure. I reached out to Greg and Mrs. Connolly, along with a few other neighbors who had been bullied by the Homeowner Association. We organized a community meeting, an informal one, away from the prying eyes of Karen and her minions. We met in Greg's backyard, away from street view. There were about 15 of us, 15 people who had been harassed, fined, and threatened into silence. I stood in the center and told them everything I knew, about the land deal, about Silver Lake Ventures, about the corruption in City Hall. At first there was silence, then anger. "They made me repaint my house twice in 1 year," someone shouted. "They shut down my small business over zoning violations that didn't exist," another person added. Greg crossed his arms. "What do we do?" I looked at Lelsey, who had come to observe. She nodded. "We make noise. Publicly." The next morning, Homeowner Association woke up to a surprise. Every house on the street had a bright yellow sign in the yard, "Stop Homeowner Association Abuse." By noon, it was all over local social media. By evening, the story was spreading like wildfire. Karen showed up at my house fuming. "Take it down," she hissed. I crossed my arms. "No, you're violating Homeowner Association sign regulations." I smiled. "So write me another fine." She turned red, shaking with rage. "You have no idea what you're doing." "Oh, I do," I said. "I'm ending this." That night, things escalated. At around 2 a.m., my security cameras caught two men creeping onto my property. One of them carried a canister, gasoline. They were going to torch my truck. I called the cops before I even ran outside. I wasn't about to let these bastards destroy my livelihood. By the time I got to the driveway, one of them had already doused my tires and the other was flicking a lighter. I grabbed the nearest thing I could, a wrench from my garage, and hurled it. It smashed into the guy's arm, sending the lighter flying. He screamed, clutching his wrist. The other one bolted. Moments later, sirens blared down the street. The cops arrived, pinning the guy to the pavement while I stood there, adrenaline pumping. Officer Rivera stepped out of his cruiser, staring at me. "You again." I pointed at the man on the ground. "Caught him red-handed." Rivera sighed. "And the other one?" I looked down the street where his buddy had disappeared into the shadows. "Got away." Karen appeared at the edge of the scene, her face pale. She had seen it all. And for the first time she looked afraid. Rivera turned to the man in cuffs. "Who sent you?" The guy clenched his jaw. "I ain't saying shit." Rivera exchanged a look with me. He knew what I knew. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the house, every rustling branch outside sent my heart hammering. The fact that they were willing to go as far as arson meant I had officially pushed them to their breaking point. That was fine, because I was ready to break them too. By morning, the news had spread. Neighbors whispered, watching from their porches as I stepped outside. Some of them, the ones who had suffered under Homeowner Association's tyranny, gave me nods of approval. Others, Karen's loyalists, shot me glares, their eyes filled with unspoken threats. But the biggest surprise came when Officer Rivera pulled up to my house, this time alone. He stepped out of his cruiser looking more tired than I had ever seen him. He wasn't holding his usual notepad. Instead, he carried a manila folder. He handed it to me without a word. I opened it, my stomach twisting as I scanned the documents. Property deeds, emails, internal Homeowner Association memos. And at the center of it all, Silver Lake Ventures, the development company Lelsey had mentioned. I looked up at him. "Where did you get this?" His jaw tightened. "You're not the only one who hates being used, Miller." For the first time since this war began, I saw hesitation in his eyes. He had been on their payroll, sure, but maybe he hadn't known the full extent of what he was being used for. Maybe, just maybe, he still had some integrity left. I gestured toward my house. "Come inside." Rivera hesitated, glancing around the street. Then, with a sigh, he followed me in. We sat in my kitchen, the folder spread between us. "They've been planning this for years," he muttered, running a hand over his face. "Buying up land through fake foreclosures, forcing people out with impossible fees, fabricating violations." I tapped one of the emails. "And this confirms what Lelsey found. City officials are in on it." He nodded. "It goes all the way up. The planning commissioner, the zoning board, even a couple of judges. You never had a chance, Miller." I clenched my fists. "Like hell I didn't." He sighed. "Look, I'm not saying I'm suddenly your best friend, but I know when I'm on the wrong side of something. I can't take these guys down myself, but I can make sure you have enough ammo to fight them." I studied him for a moment. "Why now?" He exhaled, staring at the table. "Because last night wasn't a warning. It was an escalation. They were ready to destroy your life. If you don't take them down soon, they're going to find a way to finish the job." I leaned back, thinking. I need more than this. I need undeniable proof. Rivera nodded. "I can get you access to city records, but after that, you're on your own." It was enough. For now. I spent the next 2 days collecting everything I had. Security footage, statements from neighbors, screenshots of Karen's threats. Lelsey worked her magic, connecting the dots between the Homeowner Association, Silver Lake, and city officials. By the time we were done, we had built a case strong enough to bury them. But before we could go public, Karen made her next move. It started with my water being shut off, then my electricity. Calls to the utility companies led nowhere. Then came the city inspectors, citing me for unapproved structural modifications that didn't exist. I knew what was happening. They were trying to drown me in fines, force me into selling. And then someone slashed my truck's brakes. I found out the hard way when I tried to leave my driveway and nearly ended up plowing through a stop sign. My hands were still shaking when I called Lelsey. "They're done playing," I said, voice tight. She didn't hesitate. "Then it's time we stopped playing too." That night we leaked everything. Every document, every recording, every photograph. We sent it to the local news, independent journalists, even social media. And it spread. Fast. By morning, the headlines were everywhere. City officials tied to Homeowner Association corruption scandal. Homeowner speaks out against intimidation tactics. Silver Lake Ventures accused of illegal land grabs. Karen's house was swarmed with reporters. The city commissioner issued a panicked statement denying everything. The Homeowner Association board went silent, and then the arrests started. First, a city zoning official, then one of Silver Lake's top executives, then, finally, Karen herself. I watched from my porch as the police dragged her out of her house in handcuffs, her floral blouse wrinkled, her face red with rage. She spotted me, and even then, even after everything, she sneered. "This isn't over," she hissed. I smirked. "Oh, I think it is." But she wasn't entirely wrong, because while the Homeowner Association had been dismantled and the land deal had collapsed, the city still had its corruption. The people in charge weren't going to let go of their power that easily, which meant I had one more fight left. The morning after Karen's arrest, the neighborhood was eerily silent. The Homeowner Association had collapsed overnight, its power shattered, its grip on the community broken. But I knew this wasn't the end. The real battle was just beginning. With the Homeowner Association gone, the land deal had fallen apart, but the city officials who had orchestrated everything were still in power. Silver Lake Ventures had taken a hit, but they weren't going to let this go quietly. I wasn't naive enough to think I could just walk away and expect them to leave me alone. I had humiliated them, and I knew they'd come looking for payback. I met with Lelsey in her office that afternoon. She had 2 phones on her desk, both ringing nonstop. The media storm was still raging, and she was in the center of it. She glanced up at me, looking exhausted but satisfied. "They're panicking," she said. "City Hall is scrambling. The mayor just issued a statement saying he had no prior knowledge of the land deal." I scoffed. "Yeah, sure, and I bet he never met Silver Lake's executives either." She smirked. "Exactly. But the problem is, they're trying to sweep this under the rug. They want to pin everything on Karen and the Homeowner Association, make them the scapegoats, and pretend like none of this ever happened." I leaned forward. "Then we don't let them." Lelsey nodded. "We need something bigger, something they can't ignore." That night, I met with Greg, Mrs. Connolly, and the rest of the neighbors who had stood up against the Homeowner Association. We gathered in my backyard, the weight of everything that had happened hanging heavy in the air. I laid it all out for them. The corruption, the city's involvement, the way they were trying to bury this whole thing. Greg clenched his fists. "So what do we do?" I took a deep breath. "We go public. Bigger than before. We take this straight to the people." The next morning, we did just that. We held a press conference right in front of City Hall. The media was already hungry for more, and we gave them everything. We exposed every dirty deal, every connection between city officials and Silver Lake. We had documents, emails, recorded conversations, enough evidence to bring the whole house of cards down. The mayor tried to ignore it at first, but as the pressure mounted, he had no choice but to respond. Within days, state investigators were involved. Subpoenas were issued. And then the first real blow came. Silver Lake's CEO was arrested. Then a city council member. Then another. The whole thing was unraveling faster than they could contain it. But they weren't done fighting. A week later, I got a call from Lelsey. Her voice was tight, urgent. "They're coming after you." I stiffened. "Who?" "The city. They just issued a warrant for your arrest." My stomach dropped. "For what?" She hesitated. "They're claiming fraud, that you falsified documents, that you fabricated the evidence against them." I cursed under my breath. "That's bullshit and you know it." "Of course it is," she said. but they're desperate. They need to discredit you before this goes any further." I exhaled, gripping the phone tighter. "What do I do?" There was a long pause. Then she said, "You need to disappear, just for a little while." I didn't like running. It wasn't in my nature. But Lelsey was right. If they got me in cuffs, they'd bury me in legal red tape, keep me tied up in court until the scandal blew over. I couldn't let that happen. So I left. I packed a bag, grabbed the essentials, and got into my truck. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I just drove. Hours passed. The city disappeared behind me, replaced by empty highways and open skies. I didn't know where I was headed. I just knew I needed to be somewhere they couldn't reach me. Days passed. The investigation continued. More arrests were made. And then, finally, the breaking point. The mayor himself was taken into custody, charged with conspiracy, fraud, and abuse of power. The entire corrupt machine had been dismantled. Only then did I return. When I pulled back into my driveway, the neighborhood was different. The fear that had hung over it for so long was gone. People smiled. They waved. For the first time in a long time, they weren't afraid of what the Homeowner Association or the city could do to them. Greg was the first to greet me. "Welcome home," he said. I smiled. "It's good to be back." Lelsey arrived not long after, a satisfied grin on her face. "You did it," she said. "We did it." I nodded. "So what now?" She exhaled. "Now? Now you live your life. No Homeowner Association, no threats, just peace." And for the first time in a long time, that sounded pretty damn good. I parked my truck in my driveway, right where it belonged, and no one could do a damn thing about it.